But we're anxious to hear from all of your questions.
Policy events. In what way can we make policy more digestible to bring more people to it? Because really, this is what we're all doing, and we have to figure out a way to bring policy to everybody, because if we're just doing education or like personal inspiration, we're not really doing policy. So how can we make policy digestible for the regular San Francisco person, for example?
I think a big part of it is humanizing the policy and sharing stories and showing pictures and really talking about the impacts of the policy. Because if we just talk about all these different codes and numbers and letters and blah, 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 it gets boring, and we don't really understand what it means until it happens to one of us.
Yeah, I think, in SSDP's history, so many students get involved because they themselves or someone close to them was affected by drug policy. And I think that that's a great reason to get involved in drug policy. I mean, it's the most personal thing that can happen, is knowing someone that's harmed by our messed up policies. But I think that, for myself also, I think that when I started to get involved in drug policy, my original impetus was, this is ridiculous that, smart people are getting arrested who use cannabis, and I shouldn't have to fear my own use of cannabis. And originally it was my thoughts were very centered around cannabis and then subsequently psychedelics, but I didn't really think about crack policy or heroin policy or meth policy, and I think that that's one of the reasons why, Irina and I really tried to focus on broadening the conversation about drug policy tonight, because the more I began to learn about the history of drug policy and the origin of why drugs are illegal and the harms that are caused by it, it so disproportionately affects people of color, people who are impoverished, people who just have less. And I think that for me that really hit home, and I think for a lot of drug policy folks that are devoting their lives to changing drug laws, I think that maybe it started as something that affects me, and it turned into something that is so much bigger. And I found it myself, attending my first Drug Policy Alliance conference. This is coming up next week, actually. The first one I went to was in 2007, and being in a conference full of, hundreds of people, if not thousands, it's a big conference, thousands, that I've been reading about and seeing on TV and reading about the papers, and suddenly here they were. And for me, that was super powerful. So I think, bringing in great speakers. At SSDP, we always, try to, I think there's, and it's almost like in software engineering, you have user acquisition and you have user engagement. And, you can acquire the user, however. So, sometimes we would give away free pizza and that would pack a room. But then to have something really engaging that gets people to come back, I think that's really the important part.
And I think another kind of elephant in the room when talking about activism in general is level of privilege, right? So the people who are most affected by the war on drugs aren't going to be the #1 activists. They just can't. They'll get locked up and thrown into jail. So it's kind of difficult. I mean, this is a problem that drug policy, that the movement in general experiences a lot, is getting more people involved in policies that don't directly affect them. And I think maybe a good place to start is with policies that do directly affect them. So maybe with the psychedelic community, talking about Burning Man and what's happening there right now. How many people are getting arrested for drug use at Burning Man? The place where you can run around naked and feel so incredibly free and beautiful and explore yourself and learn more about your community. You smoke a joint and you'll get arrested. Like that is actually happening to our own community. And there's the crack house law, which is the law that basically makes it really hard for places to incorporate, for big clubs, for instance, to incorporate psychedelic harm reduction. Because with psychedelic harm reduction rooms, even if you have a place where you can get free water because you might be rolling and needing some hydration, the government can actually take that and say that because of that, you knew that there was drug use happening at the event, and you were supporting this drug use, and you were supporting a huge event with drug use, and that would fall under the crack cocaine or the crack house law, which literally says you can get busted for supporting drug use. So, I mean, there are so many different things around psychedelic policy that we can start with and that we can point out and be like, this is an outrage. Start at home.
I think the humanization is really important, as you brought up. Mickey Norris, who is the editor of West Coast Leaf, did her human rights of Faces of the Drug War campaign. And I was going around posting these flyers when I was in college, and I was getting angry comments written on it by people. The slogan was "Equal rights are for everyone." There was one person in the dorm who was writing these angry comments because they felt like that poster was infringing on their struggle for equal rights. And it's like you said, it doesn't really hit home for people until you're affected by it. And it's hard to get people in this country upset about the government wiretapping our phones and reading all of our emails and things like that. And South Park just did an episode where Eric Cartman's crying, impersonating Edward Snowden. Nobody cares, Mom, nobody cares. But you know that during the high festival and convention season for the last few years, there's been a hemp expo or a cannabis expo nigh on every single month. And it's just another example of it mainstreaming. And it's going to continue to be an uphill process, but doing the education and the outreach and things like you guys did for us tonight, and just to keep doing it, keep driving it home. And more mainstream media outlets are slowly starting to pick it up or pick up their tiny little angles on it. You know, we saw the Fair Sentencing Act finally get passed, and that was one of the things that really got me involved in this movement in the beginning, was getting kicked out of a Catholic high school for smoking a joint, which didn't even happen on campus, and then finding out why cannabis was made illegal in the first place, which was the timber and textiles conspiracy that you mentioned during your talk. And then I got to UC Santa Cruz and I learned about the sentencing disparities between crack cocaine and powdered cocaine. And it boggled my mind then, as it does now, how people aren't more outraged about it. But that's what we're here for. That's why groups like SSDP, Drug Policy Alliance, ERIE, NORML exist. And we just need to get a little bit more organized and agree on an initiative for 2016 and get some more sentencing reform passed in the state of California.
Larry, I think Adrian has a second.
Hey, you know what, I'm just gonna say screw it and just put it out there. I have a production company right downtown here, and I did 10 years for possession in Detroit, so it's kind of something close, you know, it's close to my heart anyways, and I've got a bachelor's in organic chemistry, so I kind of spent a couple years doing clandestine, you know, things that probably were reckless, but you know, it's been 20 years too, and I still feel the effects of it daily, you know. But we're ramping up to pre-production on a feature documentary on the war on drugs, specifically called "How Heroin Saved My Life," and so obviously, you know, the slant it's taking, but I got pushed here by my partners to actually come, because I'm, you know, really introverted. I don't like doing the public thing. So anyways, they kind of pushed me to come to kind of, you know, let people know, because we'll be needing people, not necessarily revealed on camera, obviously, but, you know, we'd like a lot of people's experiences, you know, get on board with the project. I just, you know, that's all I had to say. I'm sorry.
I think that's great. I mean, there's so many new documentaries about the drug war coming out every year now, and I think that we're seeing quite a surge in them. It's great. I mean, more talking, the better.
And I really like that name too. It really kind of points to the whole Maslow's hierarchy thing that I was talking about at the beginning, is like, you know, people assume that these harder drugs and these scary drugs are all bad things, but a lot of times it's the only thing that'll actually help you survive.
Yeah, right. You know, I mean, Let's just, and that's something that we hear constantly too, already, is that, mainly teenage years, about till early 20s, people, escapism still so key to humanity that, and then I've kind of been, really been fascinated by infusions for so many years. There's a book called The Cosmic Serpent and DNA and the Origin of Knowledge, which is about specifically ayahuasca, and it's I highly suggest it, but it's I'm sorry, I blink. Move on. I'm sorry, folks.
Great.
No, that's okay. We appreciate that perspective, and it's an important one too. In the movie Drugstore Cowboy, Bukowski goes on a rant about how it's completely anathema to the establishment that anybody could be a functional heroin user in this country. But a lot of doctors are actually functional morphine users because they have access to a controlled, purified supply, and they know how to control their dosage, and they have consistent product and access to it. So, yeah, and to boot, we've got a ton of research from both Germany and England on harm reduction therapy and addiction management. 15 years of research that shows that it reduces harm, it reduces crime, it reduces all the social ills that are associated with it and are used by the drug warriors to justify this expenditure of both money and human lives. And yeah, I'm with you.
Vancouver also has one of the only safe injection sites in the world where heroin addicts can get clean rigs and have a doctor present and inject in a safe environment where they're not using a puddle full of water and hiding from the police. And recently Health Canada actually just passed a law allowing doctors there to prescribe heroin for maintenance as opposed to methadone, because methadone has a longer half-life, it's more addictive, and the withdrawal from it is worse. So just keeping people on the drug they're already on is just scientifically, like you said, more effective treatment methodology, and we're starting to finally see people open up to that because it's taking the profit out of the black market, out of the criminals, and controlling purity and ensuring people don't OD. So.
And there is some talk right now of starting a safer injection site in San Francisco. To be continued.
Yeah. You got the mic.
Hi there. Actually, I had something else I wanted to ask, but with respect to the last thing you said, I just read on Jabbour Maltai's website a letter to the lady in charge of Health Canada or something, or their drug czar, whatever they call it. And although the law had been passed, it was an experimental law to try a pilot project to maintain heroin addicts on heroin. She is acting to suppress it and not put it into action. And Jabbour is writing to her saying, instead of being, the minister of health, you should be the minister of disease. And he has a long argument for that. But I had a question about one of the slides in your presentation where you compared the percentage of ethnic groups taking drugs and the percentage in jail, which of course showed that blacks are much more disproportionately represented. But anyway, the first one that showed the percentages of the populace taking drugs, I got the impression from looking at that it meant that all ethnic groups use drugs at approximately the same rate. Is that true? Is that the impression that you have from those statistics, or what?
Well, that particular slide supports that. And that data came from, I believe it was from NIDA surveys. There's this annual survey that they do. Irina, you mentioned another study that actually showed that in certain cases, sometimes actually white people use drugs more than people of color. So I think it depends on what data source you look at and what drugs you're measuring too. and whether it's self-responding or, I think if you look at, if you try to gather the data from different sources, you're going to get skewed results. If you look at emergency room visits, you're going to get different results than if you look at people self-reporting.
Right.
It's hard to calculate something that's illegal.
Yeah.
Well, and in terms of another slide where you were showing addiction rate versus money being spent, that slide indicated that the addiction rate hadn't changed significantly. My particular interest is in opiate addiction, and between the NIDA and NIM, National Institute of Mental Health sites, the impression I got from looking at those two sites, and of course the reporting is different because they consider different things, but it suggested that that the number of heroin addicts at present, within the past year when I looked at the site, was around 500,000. And I can imagine that the true number is actually higher. But comparing that with figures from when William Burroughs published his first book, Junkie, which was in 1956, the figures I have for at that period was that there were about 20,000 junkies in the U.S., all of them in New York City. And now there's, what is that, 100? There's like 25 times as many in that period from 56 to 2006. So in 50 years, that increased by 25 times. So that would indicate that addiction, opiate addiction at least, is significantly on the rise.
I think what's interesting, and actually we are seeing heroin, particularly on the East Coast, because it's in powder form, it's very pure. High school kids are starting to get access to it and insufflate it because it looks like cocaine and it's not that scary anymore. You don't need to inject it. It's not tar. So I think we are starting to see an increase in especially youth usage of pure powder heroin, and that's a really scary thing. We're seeing that in New York City suburbs, for instance. I'm from New York originally, so I'm very familiar with what's going on there. But I will say, too, that over the course of history, I think that drug addiction rates, anthropologists have found stay pretty consistent, and the types of drugs that people choose can change. So, over time we see people abusing different drugs, and that is always ebbing and flowing, and there are minor fluctuations in overall addiction percentage, but I think it's something that just tends to stay fairly constant. And also I think there's a difference between usage and abuse, right? So the number of people that actually are substance dependent is the thing that tends to stay kind of similar. I think that you do see little spikes and dips in drug popularity over time, but I think that's a different thing.
Well, one last question.
Yeah.
Did that addiction rate include alcohol?
No, it did not.
Ah.
I don't believe so.
Well, there are
Alcohol's not a drug.
There are like 20 times as many alcoholics as junkies. And having been there and done that, I've realized that alcoholics are basically the same kind of people as junkies, but their body says this substance does it and instead of that one. But they have the same kinds of issues, and it leads to the same kinds of ends for them.
Alcohol is 1,000 times more destructive than heroin. I mean, heroin by itself, it's the cut.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a legalization issue there.
Yes, another little skewed thing about our country's drug policy, that alcohol and tobacco kill 500,000 people a year each, and all illicit drugs combined amount to maybe 12 to 15,000 deaths per year. It's such a disparity between how much money we're spending on this and how much damage is being done by these things that aren't even on the drug schedule, although the economies associated with them basically built this country in some small part.
I think also if you look at the number of accidents and indirect deaths related to alcohol, it's staggeringly high. And same thing with tobacco. You have secondhand smoke and the effects of that. So you're talking about even higher numbers there of deaths there. Just staggering.
An important thing to realize also, and this relates to your interview with Newt Gingrich, Dr. Andrew Weil wrote an essay called Why People Take Drugs, and he basically proved with a number of different examples that altering our state of consciousness is a sort of a biological imperative. He found a statistically higher correlation in children who reported being twirlers, spinning around to make yourself dizzy as children. Higher percentage of those children have tried psychedelics by the time they're 30. So the topic of this evening being cognitive liberty, it's important to note that, you know, whether you drink coffee, you have a beer when you come home, you do yoga, you go for a run to get that runner's high, or you smoke marijuana, or occasionally have a medicinal journey with an entheogen, it's not a bad thing. It's not a wrong thing. It's been demonized by our culture, but it's, you know, you have horses will eat rotting apples off the ground because they're fermented and they'll get drunk off of them when there's perfectly good fruit right next to them on the tree. They've done studies with rats and the cocaine pellets. The birds get drunk off berries and then fly into the windows, and eucalyptus leaves are like PCP to koalas.
You know, that points to, wow, really? Wow.
They're vicious little bastards.
Apparently. And that points to such a bigger problem in our society today, which is like, you know, when I grow up, this is what I'm gonna be. And I mean, I was shopping for curtains the other day, right? And I went to good old Target and went into the adult curtain section. Brown, black, white, super boring. I was like, where's the lime green, right? So I had to go into the children's section to buy curtains, because when you're an adult, you don't like colors. When you're an adult, you don't play pretend. When you're in high school, you don't have recess anymore, and you can't imagine anymore. You know, we're adults now. It's really terrible. And I mean, the other day I saw a little kid just dancing on Mission Street, just really getting into it and twirling and being silly and expressing herself. And I thought, what if an adult was doing that right now? People would be like, whoa, crazy person, okay. Right. Suddenly when we grow up, we're not allowed to be human anymore.
It shows the biological imperative, or the need almost to change, for humans to in one form or another, radically alter their consciousness.
Yeah.
Which is why Burning Man is so fun.
And also I think it's interesting that nobody teaches kids to how to twirl around. Like, they don't need a drug dealer to tell them to do that.
Oh, I got another good one. The glue sniffing epidemic in the 80s didn't become an epidemic until 2020 did a report about it. Yeah. And then kids see this news report, they're like, I can get high from sniffing glue, I'm going to try that.
It occurs to me that drug policy is a social construction like anything else that's complex in our culture. And we keep using the word government when we talk about it. It's illogical, it's outrageous, it's demonic, it's all these things, and we keep using the word government. It's clear to me that the government is an arbiter of power for other interests, and I would like you guys to address who benefits from the drug war. And beyond the alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceutical industries, I'd like you to consider what role the ideological forces play, like racist and fundamentalist Christians, evangelicals, and where is this coming from, and who's orchestrating this incredible oppression, and identify these structures in our culture so that we can understand that to them it's quite logical. If you're a slaver in the Old South, slavery makes perfect sense. It's how you make your money. There's all sorts of things that make a lot of sense when you do it for money and do it out of greed. So I'm curious about what you think are who are the people benefiting from this that are working so hard to, and one thing to consider is how many of those people would vote Republican that were in prison these many years since Nixon started the war on drugs, and how close all of our national elections have become. Role that plays.
I'd love to add a couple quick facts. The first is that alcohol and tobacco donate $1 million a day to anti-drug propaganda. And that's because they have a market incentive to do so. When Colorado passed their medical marijuana law, they saw something like a 5-ish%, I think it was, reduction in statewide beer sales. and they saw a similar percentage reduction in alcohol-related automobile fatalities that year. So I think it's really interesting to see, quite literally, recreational drug use shift from beer to cannabis, and a very well-documented increase in public safety. So I think that's kind of cool. But getting back to your question, yeah, I mean, I think that alcohol and tobacco are tremendously threatened by especially cannabis. I think cannabis will eventually land in a similar market to sort of the beer market, where we have large suppliers that already have plans. I mean, we know that large-scale tobacco companies already know exactly what they're going to be doing when they're able to produce cannabis en masse. And I think that we're going to see, just like in the beer market, 95% of beer is controlled by a couple of corporations. And then the entire craft brewing market is 5%. And I think we're going to see the same thing in cannabis. So, I mean, at least tobacco, I think, is hip to the marijuana thing. But, they're trying to keep things the way they are for now anyway. And I think the other thing that's interesting to point out is, the industrial prison complex, which we just did not have time or energy to get into in this talk, but is tremendous. I mean, it costs something like $30,000 to $50,000 a year to keep a prisoner behind bars. A number of prisons are now privately owned and operated. The state contracts out to corporations. One such of those corporations, GeoCorp, I think they got renamed recently, is traded quite publicly on the stock exchange. So there's a market incentive to have more prisoners in jail in our country, quite literally in our financial markets. So when you talk about who benefits, everyone benefits. You and I indirectly benefit in our savings accounts because there's a market incentive. So the system has been constructed in such a way that financially, I mean, there's a huge interest in keeping things the way there are.
Heteronormative white males benefit? Yeah, I mean, that's a whole social construct in itself, but white people hold the power, white males hold the power.
I think it's really interesting too, like when SSDP was working on reforming the Higher Education Act. This is the act that controls the FAFSA financial aid. And it used to be that if you applied for financial aid and you had a drug conviction prior to college, you would be denied aid. Presently, you can still lose aid in college if you get a conviction, but at least if you have a conviction prior to college, you're now no longer completely ineligible. And that's because of the work SSDP did to reform the Higher Education Act. But there was a representative, a Republican from some southern state, Souder, Indiana, introduced this amendment to the Higher Education Act originally that added the checkbox that asked, have you ever been convicted of a drug crime? And it's the only checkbox on the FAFSA that has to do with your criminal past. They don't ask about rape or arson or anything else, just drugs. And Souder was at a press conference, and of course he's not in office anymore. He was a Republican from the South, so he's ousted on a sex scandal. Not drugs. Although arguably, that sex releases a lot of chemicals in our brains. But at a press conference, I think he really summed up the reason why the drug war is pretty screwed up. And we were asking him a question. Somebody was asking him a question about whether or not he actually thinks that this, what the point of this amendment to the Higher Education Act was. And he said something like, well, I think my kids would think twice at a party before puffing on a joint if they knew their future was on the line. I'm paraphrasing, of course. And then he paused for a second and goes, well, not that my kids would qualify for financial aid anyway. And I think that was just such a really good example. Like, exactly, right? Rich white people are not affected by this. In New York City, the marijuana arrest capital of the world, we arrest more people for pot than any other city in the world in New York. It's really staggering. I think it's like 5,000 a month or something like that. The vast majority of those are people of color, people of lower socioeconomic status. If you're a white female, in Manhattan, you have almost no chance of getting arrested. If you're a black male in, Bed-Stuy or in Bushwick, you have an almost 100% chance of getting illegally searched at some point on your way home. So it's really just, staggering.
And it's interesting to see too with the legalization of marijuana how the tables have kind of been turning, how the people who have the most knowledge about how to grow the best weed are the ones who may have been growing weed before it was legal. And now suddenly with these new dispensaries opening up, it's not people who have never touched weed before it was legal who are stepping in and saying, oh, I'll take charge of this dispensary. It's maybe people who have had some previous power. So it's interesting to kind of see that power shift happening with that reform.
The Seagram's family were bootleggers during Prohibition. And when Prohibition was lifted, they became one of the most successful American-owned liquor companies. And that's just how it is. It's a transition from a black market to a gray market to eventually into a full legal market. And it creates a lot of headaches for everyone involved during that transition.
I think another thing that we haven't mentioned too is how your right to vote is actually taken away from you if you have a federal offense. I mean, if you have a felony conviction. That's appalling.
I think it's very state by state.
Yeah. It's terrible.
I was going to sort of ask a question, comment about the Oreo, but before I do that, I just wanted to say I think that there's also a high investiture in the cognitive liberty or the repression of the cognitive liberty of those that could actually get out there in a very strong, forceful, revolutionary kind of way. So if you've got those people in jail, and you've got them out of voting polls, and you've got them kind of marginalized in society, then the ability of the mass of people to transform things becomes very limited. So I think there's a large investiture in keeping the way things they are, keeping things the way they are, so that those that are working with the medicines or growing the medicines or importing the medicines can't actually distribute them, can't actually get them out there, can't actually make the changes. So the Oreo, it was, kind of, you presented it in sort of a lighthearted way, but I thought that there's a lot of compelling information there around the effects of high fructose corn syrup, genetically modified foods, and the long-range implications of those on the human body and human system. And essentially what you guys are talking about is, do we have the right to put things into our body, whether they're good for us or not? And what are the implications then on ourselves and on our societal systems if we put these things in our body? And I think that the interesting piece, and I'd love to hear you guys talk more about this, is what they seem to be wanting to regulate is what they're able to see sort of the immediacy of. You can clearly tell when someone is on a drug or drunk, and it's taken us a while to change our opinions on tobacco, right, because of seeing the correlation between tobacco and cancer. Longer term is going to be, high fructose corn syrup, genetically modified foods, and whatnot. So I think there's something to be teased out there around what can be demonstrated, and also what the agenda is behind regulating what we can ingest and why we can ingest it. And I think also the looking at what the different drugs are, what their efficacy is, or what they do to the system. We know caffeine gives us a buzz. We know that sugar can give us a buzz. We know that these different drugs have different things that they do for the body. So what do you guys see a strategy being for beginning to look at the regulation or the understanding of drugs the way we look at how we're using food or how we're using beverages or any kind of medication?
Great question. Yeah. I think we want to avoid, sorry. I think we want to avoid, like, I mean, you know, the answer I think we're saying as sort of drug policy reformers, or at least the SSDP answer to drug reform, is that as long as drugs are criminalized, we create crime, we create black market incentive, we harm people more than the potential harms of the drugs. And so, you know, that creates a tricky situation, and this is part of the reason why we wanted to broaden this topic today to more than just entheogenic policy, because it's one thing to say, yes, LSD for psychospiritual benefit should be legal. It's a whole other thing to say that heroin should be legal. And to that regard, I don't think that Irina or I would argue that we should have heroin vending machines out on the street. But I do think that you have to have some legal regulatory market, or you're still going to have that black market. So perhaps that regulatory market is something like Canada is doing in Vancouver, where if you test positive for opiates, you can access opiates in a safe injection facility and use them on site like that. You know, I don't really have all the answers for every drug and every drug's policy. But I think, you know, what we're talking about is just reasonable regulation. So, you know, it becomes very controversial. For instance, New York City recently passed a law banning the sale of large quantities of high fructose containing drinks. So fast food restaurants can no longer sell a super large soda. They also have to include calories on the menus as big as the price and things like that. But yeah, and this was a really controversial move that New York City did. I'm surprised actually it wasn't San Francisco that first did it. You know, because of the epidemic proportion, you know, the number of people with diabetes, the number of people with heart disease, you know, in America is staggering. We're starting to finally realize that it's due to our diet, right? It's not, people aren't fat because they're lazy necessarily. They're fat because we had a shitty food system. So, yeah, I think it's really tricky, and I think the answer is in reasonable regulation, and maybe corporations shouldn't be allowed to sell 2-liter size single-serving drinks. Just like maybe we shouldn't have crack and heroin vending machines. So, you know, I think that the answer is just going to be in reasonable regulation. And, you know, we got to figure out what that is for every drug, whether it's high fructose corn syrup or whether it's heroin. I think we got to look at the potential for addiction and the potential for harm. And, you know.
Yeah, and I think with that too is really the biggest thing that kind of is similar in both food and drugs is reasonable education. I mean, right now, at least with some food, we're starting to be able to see what the real ingredients are and how it's actually being processed. But if you buy drugs from a drug dealer, you know, maybe they'll say like, no, it's good stuff, you're good, you know, oh yeah, that's heroin, trust me. It might be like, I don't know, it's good. And then the only way you find out is by taking it and seeing how you feel and experimenting with your own body. And I think there's just such a huge lack of drug information in our country, reliable drug information, where the only thing that we have is a cop coming into elementary schools and saying, don't do drugs, this is how you say no, let's practice saying no, and then in some cases actually showing a whole briefcase filled with different drugs and saying these will all kill you. And then kids get into school, they try one of those drugs, it doesn't kill them, and then they figure, oh, okay, that was all a lie, they're all okay to use, they're all okay to put in my body, and my body will be fine. So, yeah, and another point that I wanted to make too was, from what you said at the beginning of your question, please be really careful. You know, you're talking about how the government will kind of focus in on the people that can make a change and that are rabble-rousers and are activists, and please be careful with text messages and emails and Facebook. I mean, I know it's really easy in California to be like, oh, it's cool, you know, I'll just like text someone real quick and tell them that I have some MDMA. Don't do it, it's not necessary. Just, if you want to talk about it, be like, hey friend, do you want to come over? You know, don't use code. People can read through that. They will get your text messages if they want to target you. Just, it's not necessary.
I have a question, well, a comment and a question. When the topic came up before about the government being a construction, I was kind of sitting in that space too, and I was thinking that the war on drugs is basically a smaller war, and the larger wars, we're a war culture and have been for 50, 250 years, you know, and so that there's something about being a war culture. When you do that type of operation in your foreign policy, you have to mimic that in your domestic policy because you have to perpetuate the illusion of it having some logic to do this war abroad. So what you do is you take whatever is sacred and you make it profane. And this is the battle that you talk about with the cognitive. It's literally an Orwellian switch that we're trying to fight our way out of, in a sense. So I think this is something just to keep in mind in the background, because we could lawyer up and they can lawyer up, and then you have this battle that takes a lot of time and money and energy, but you're really not talking about what foreign policy is and the beneficiaries. I used to think about, well, what would I rather have if someone would offer me a tanker full of pure Iraqi fuel or opium? What would I take if I was going to cash out, you know, door number 1 or door number 2? I would take the door number 2, you know, with the opium, because it's probably worth 10,000 times more than the gasoline. So there's a lot of, you know, insurgency wars that can be carried out by keeping that elephant out of the press, you know. Any comments?
I mean, I think that the point you make is really clear, and the fact that it's even called the war on drugs, it's such a dramatic thing. You know, it's a war, America. We're in it together. We're gonna fight these drugs. And when you really break it down, how can you have a war against drugs? Who's gonna win? You know, the drugs. We won. It's over.
So that tends to be actually horrifyingly, but it is a pretty common prevailing view of drugs still to this day, is people assign real personalities to them.
Yeah.
Cocaine is the devil, it's evil, you know, like they're an actual conscious. It's crazy. I mean, there's a lot of parts of America, and I guess that all just comes into education being, you know, our responsibility.
And I think kind of the way that America tends to militarize everything, when you look at the militarization of the police force. I mean, in Prince George's County, Maryland, where I used to live, there were 2 SWAT team raids a day, and 80% of them were for nonviolent offenses. You know, someone would have a warrant out for their arrest, and a SWAT team would show up. I mean, it was incredible. And actually, one of our neighbors in that community, with the mayor of Berwyn Heights, the little community that right next to the one that I lived in, a SWAT team showed up at his door because there was 32 pounds of marijuana that was shipped to his house that he had nothing to do with. It was just kind of a drop-off that someone was going to swoop up while he wasn't home. The cops intercepted it, placed it on his doorstep, and then once he got home from walking his dogs, they busted through his door, shot both of his Labrador retrievers who were running away from them, threw him onto the ground next to them, and started questioning him, trying to get him to come out about what this 32-pound package was all about. And he kept saying, I'm the mayor, I'm the mayor, I don't understand. And they're like, yeah, right, you're the mayor. I mean, it's completely traumatizing and way too overdone. Let's chill out a bit. We're all about wars here, though.
Yeah, I think, you know, and also the use, the sort of ritualistic use of SWAT teams in law enforcement executing warrants is something that has increased dramatically over the last couple of decades, particularly in line with the war on drugs. 50 or 60 years ago, it was incredibly rare to see a SWAT team executing a warrant. And now it's basically commonplace. So that change has been a tremendous change in American policy. And I think that, you know, we've just gotten so very draconian in our drug policy. And I think, yeah, a lot of that comes back to the fact that we're a war culture. I think a lot of that comes back to the fact that politicians in America are basically like children, and, you know, they're running on platforms that, you know, people can emotionally get behind. And I think that it's very easy to scare and intimidate people into fearing drugs and then needing a politician to come in that's a tough on drugs stance, you know, and I think it's a very reactionaryist culture. I'll give an example quickly. When, you know, there's been a few cases actually of postal workers going postal, and going into a post office and killing a whole bunch of people and then themselves. It's actually happened more than once, right? So kind of crazy. But after I think the first or second time that this happened, Congress passed a law. They were like, we're going to stop this. We're going to stop this epidemic of postal workers killing people. And they made it illegal to bring a firearm into a post office. And they passed this law and received press, and I'm sure the politicians that did it patted each other on the back. And now if you go into a post office, there's a sign that says that you can't bring a weapon inside. So you're telling me that if you're all gung-ho to go kill your boss, a bunch of innocent people, and yourself, you're going to get to the door, read the sign that says you can't bring a weapon inside, and go, oh, shucks. So I think it's just like, that law was totally a waste of time, right? Just like a lot of these laws are. And it's just a very reactionary thing that looks good, gets a good soundbite, and makes people happy and cut a ribbon and move on.
Makes footage for cops.
Yeah.
TV shows.
Yeah, exactly. So.
But I do also really want to point out that being tough on drugs is no longer popular in most states. I mean, popular belief is really shifting on that, as you've seen with marijuana legalization just recently. And a lot of politicians who try to be tough on drugs end up actually getting less votes than their counterpart.
Yeah, for the first time ever, I saw a politician say a quote that's like, even if it costs me votes, I don't support medical marijuana. And, when I was in college, I never saw those kinds of quotes in the media. So I think that that's an excellent realization.
Well, we're kind of in a unique time with that too, I guess, because we've got kind of the last of the 50s World War II generation dying off that were stalwarts of the anti-drug mentality at their core. And so, the further we get into younger people getting into the ranks, I suppose that's kind of inevitable. Hopefully. I don't know.
Just one thing. I was going to ask this question to both of you, actually, just your thoughts on this. Along these same lines, Mark Leno, who's our rep here from San Francisco, had introduced Senate Bill 649, which would have reduced simple nonviolent drug possession for small quantities of most things to a wobbler offense, so basically giving prosecutorial discretion whether it be charged as a felony or a misdemeanor, which is intended to reduce prison overcrowding and this, excessive sentencing for drug possession, nonviolent offenses, things like that. It passed both houses and Governor Brown vetoed it. Your thoughts?
That's screwed up, man.
Big surprise.
I think, DAs have a tremendous amount of power too.
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting thing that basically a DA, if they wanted to, could legalize drugs in a certain district. And I think some of them are appointed and some of them are elected, so it kind of depends on the district. I think they may have different incentive there. But yeah, anytime, I think that's one way of advancing drug policy. I think it's this incremental thing.
Also, police unions have an incredible amount of power. That was our biggest fight when I worked on Maryland Good Samaritan law stuff. That was everyone else was in support, and then suddenly one police officer showed up and said, well, I don't know, this might not be that great of a thing, and bam, every single line of the bill was scratched out except for the last line, which said that if you call for help, it can be used as a mitigating factor. So basically, once you're up on the stand, the judge can be like, okay, good job, you called for help anyway, back to your possession charge.
Yeah, and we've tried twice now to get a medical marijuana regulation bill passed through the state legislature, and it was the police chiefs union that lobbied against it. ASA brought a whole bus full of people out to Sacramento and talked to almost every state representative, and the bill got pulled the next week because the police union was lobbying against it. And you'll hear police officers say, we don't make the laws, we just enforce them. But in practice, that's not the case. That here they are influencing public policy, subverting the will of the voters. Interesting side note, Terrence Hallinan, when he was district attorney of San Francisco, did just that. For 8 years, he said, I will not prosecute a cannabis offense in this city. And that was from about 1993 until about 2000. 92 probably to 2000. And I saw him speak here when I was 18 years old in a smoke-filled room in a dispensary, and he had actually credited the...
Upstairs at GM?
It was upstairs at the Patients Resource Center on Divisadero, but he was probably doing a tour because he was thanking the medical marijuana community for re-electing him. Yeah. And that's one of the things that helped get the dispensary industry, which still operates very much in a gray area, off the ground. You know, because these harm reduction cannabis clubs were allowed to operate while he was the district attorney of San Francisco.
Well, also in 1993, San Francisco passed a citywide initiative, if I recall.
Yeah.
Well, I don't recall because I wasn't here, but I read about it. That basically allowed for some dispensary-like operations, and I think the first one was out of an apartment by the original guy who wrote that initiative. I'm forgetting his name, David, maybe something like that.
Dennis Perrin.
Dennis, there you go. Who was a big activist in the LGBT community and really working with a lot of people that were dying of AIDS at the time and using cannabis to help ease that pain. So, San Francisco has a really rich history of being very forward-thinking when it comes to cannabis. It's awesome.
Yes, but our state legislature still can't manage to pass a regulation bill, which is what a lot of the local governments are really asking for, and would make law enforcement's job generally easier.
Yeah, and the other thing too is even as a medical marijuana patient, while you might be immune from arrest if you follow all your, cross all your T's and dot all your I's, you could still get fired from your job, and you could still not have a legal leg to stand on. There was a case recently, I think, of a Walmart employee who was fired because Walmart corporate has this policy, and argued that, hey, I'm a medical marijuana patient. This isn't right. And that was struck down in court. They upheld the will of the corporation to fire the person because patients aren't protected. And similarly, I think that it's still an issue. In theory, you could lose your kids, lose your housing, lose your employment. So I think that we still have a lot of patient rights to protect in California.
Yeah, and a bill to address just that also failed in our state legislature last year.
Exactly.
And I really like pointing out too that the federal government still provides bins full of joints to a few federal medical marijuana patients, which is something that isn't talked about much. But a while back, the federal government started this a research study with people who had really debilitating diseases, debilitating, thank you, diseases, and has continued that study, and in doing so, there are still, I think maybe four remaining patients who every month receive this huge jar of pre-rolled joints from the federal government.
It was made in Mississippi, and it's been frozen since the 90s.
Yeah.
And,
Probably not the best, but...
I actually talked to one of the patients. I got to hold and see the tin. It's this big metal tin, and they get like 300 pre-rolled joints a day, and it's about 10% THC, maybe a little less. It's pretty low quality, but the patient I spoke to says he unrolls the cigarettes and packs it in a vaporizer. So
And that's actually an infuriating thing with the research into things is, on that same subject, is a lot of research people are complaining that the government will only give them substandard
more than that, actually,
precursor to work.
MAPS, the organization I mentioned earlier, who's working in the psychedelic nonprofit pharmaceutical space, filed a lawsuit against the government because they wanted the right to grow cannabis, or researchers to grow cannabis for their studies. Do you know an update? What's going on with that?
Oh yeah, we lost it in the federal appeals court.
Okay. Shucks. I think it's fascinating too, like the response from the feds, one of the arguments was, hey, we want to study CBD, and there's no CBD pot available. And the response from the government was, take the existing pot and lace it with synthetic CBD. And it's like, how is this a fucking study? Like, what are we even studying at this point?
Because they know they're going to throw it away.
Yeah, the majority of medical marijuana research that's attempted at through the federal government is completely denied. I mean, it's this hilarious cycle where they keep going, well, we can't support medical marijuana because there's not enough research. And then you're like, okay, I want to do this research. And they're like, nope.
But then
denied.
Mayor LaGuardia took that under his own hands and paid for his own study, and you know, and he unfortunately found to the side of the positive side, you know, with doctors, and so the government they buried that. And
Well,
he
With
didn't-
Watergate Commission.
Yeah.
And then the government also says that, well, that means that it's only that strain that does it, you know, because all marijuana is so different, we can't actually prove that it applies to all marijuana everywhere. So it's impossible. Also, the drug czar, as a part of his job description, it actually specifically says that he needs to be against the legalization of drugs. That's a part of his job description.
Just a quick question here. Are you familiar, I'm sure you probably are, with the rat park studies, and how has that had an effect on policy, and sort of what can we do to sort of speak to that, you know, with our city context and packing everyone into these small spaces? The rat,
There was some recent criticism of those studies too, if I recall, in the methodology. But it is an interesting study. Basically, I don't know, you want to summarize it, Larry?
basically, they were testing rats to see if they would self-administer, I think, cocaine and heroin or whatever. And then this one guy just figured out that maybe it's the fact that they're kept in these locked boxes all the time, that's why they administer. So he provided them a big park to play in, and the self-administration went down, and they actually enjoyed playing in the park.
So they had some rats in like little cages with like noisy air conditioners and shitty environments, and they used drugs more basically than like the happy rats with the nice park.
Which of course speaks to how our cities are, you know, formulated and designed, where we're all packed into these little areas.
Right.
And, you know, so.
And it goes back to what you were saying about Maslow's hierarchy. You know, if you're, you know, it's a hierarchy of needs, right? So if your needs are to be able to sleep without the earth vibrating beneath you, or without a blanket, you know, you're in a totally different place than if you're looking to, you know, find love or self-actualize, or, you know, one of the higher needs.
And I mean, look at the TL, the Tenderloin in San Francisco. It's a prime example of that, where people are just, gentrification is happening everywhere, and people are just pushed from one side to another by cop presence, and then suddenly they're squeezed into this tiny little section where housing is a little cheaper, and the only thing they can do is sell drugs because they've been chased out of every other corner by the criminal policies, and then what? I mean, it becomes the center for a lot of drug activity.
I just wanted to, this is more of a comment. It seems like we're so stalwart against performing cannabis research in the country, but amazingly, I've been doing a meta-analysis of the endocannabinoid system and the effects CBD has in mitigating neurodegeneration processes. And amazingly enough, if I go through my bibliography, maybe 40 or 50% of the articles I'm citing are coming out of Israel. And even
right.
we support Israel financially in so many ways, and I just find it a bit ironic that you know, they're like our lapdog, we're giving them money, we give them weapons, we do whatever, and then they're literally leading the way, the world in cannabis research.
Yeah, and also recently there was a MDMA study that a friend of ours did in Israel, so they have quite a budding amount. I'm not really sure why Israel is so forward-thinking when it comes to some of these drug policies, but it seems like it just might be easier to get some of them through. You know, I could postulate one theory, which is that the government is not a monolithic thing, and I think it's becoming less monolithic every day. In other words, the FDA is pretty independently controlled from the DEA, is pretty independently controlled from the executive branches. But, you know, these are organizations with their own little fiefdoms and kingdoms and controllers. And in Israel, actually, they have kind of the opposite problem that we have in their political party system. So we have a very staunchly two-party system. It creates a very divisive culture. It basically means either one party or the other controls and is able to pass legislation. In Israel, they have like 16 dominant political parties, and they have to form coalitions to get anything done. And actually, they have kind of the opposite problem, where it's actually difficult to get the plurality they need to pass laws in a lot of cases. And I think that's kind of a fascinatingly different problem to be dealing with politically. I can't imagine trying to lobby in that sort of environment. But perhaps it means that because things are so much more fractured, you can find support in one agency or another. And maybe that has something to do with it, I don't know. But I think it's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask if you feel we can draw any meaningful parallels, lessons from Portugal that might be applicable in our country.
We need socialized medicine.
Yes.
Decriminalize, at least.
The problem with countries like Portugal and Israel is they're much more culturally homogenized and they're much smaller geographically. And that's one of the main reasons we can't get this legislation passed through the California state legislature, because California is such a diverse state. It's one of the main reasons we can't get any meaningful traction on drug policy reform at the federal level, because there's so many of these entrenched, the old guard of drug warriors that you were mentioning, that are still in office. So I think it's just continuing to force the debate to the forefront whenever possible, to fall back on science, common sense, and harm reduction, and just keep pushing that boulder up the hill, because there's nothing else we can do except do what we're doing and keep doing it right, and keep following the best practices models, pushing for the research into things like CBD, which is a miracle component of cannabis, and it's something that's probably been in our food supply for the last 600,000 years. When you study the endocannabinoid system, that's one of the implications. So I wish I had a simple answer for that, but it's just keep fighting the good fight.
And I think that a lot of drug warriors look to other countries when we point out, well, it works in these other countries, look at all these statistics, and they say, well, we're America and we're different. But it's like, oh, but we're all humans. I mean, that's just a terrible answer. But I think actually, I'm pretty sure that in Portugal, drug use rates actually lowered after decriminalization happened. And I know that happened in all of the states that have legalized medical marijuana here, which is interesting, especially with young drug use, young marijuana use, because once medical marijuana became legalized and suddenly, it's my grandmother smoking pot, it's not that exciting anymore.
Gil Kurlowski, who's our most recent drug czar, just stepped down. He's now going to head the Office of Border Patrol and Customs. So the drug czar spot is vacant currently, and Drug Policy Alliance just issued a press release within the last 2 weeks calling on President Obama to appoint somebody who will rely more on common sense, on science, who will not pursue this steadfast obstructionism of drug policy reforms, particularly related to cannabis. The press release mentioned the recent DOJ policy memo saying they weren't going to obstruct the legalization being implemented in Colorado and Washington. It cited Colorado and Washington and basically said, look, you need to put somebody in this position who doesn't have their head up their ass. Please, this is an opportunity for him to do +2 for drug policy reform, right?
Yeah, and I think the other takeaway from Portugal too is just not only has drug abuse rates actually been able to be impacted, but I think just the overall quality of public health there has gone up, and I think that's the main takeaway, is that no longer do we have this marginalization, this tremendous marginalization of drug addicts that we have in our culture. Now, whether it's rich, bougie white people hiding their opiate use in the bathroom, or whether it's people in the Tenderloin hiding in the shadows, people hide their drug use in America, and it means that we don't talk about it, we don't treat it, and that is the most harmful thing of all, I think, when it comes to being able to help people that use drugs. And in Portugal, finally, we have that taboo being lifted a bit, and we have people, like Irina getting out into the communities and helping drug addicts, and those populations aren't so hard to find and scattered. We're actually able to access them with public health. So I think that's really the takeaway in Portugal, is just seeing the quality of these people's lives increase, and I think that just goes a long way. It also speaks to a society, like what you do with your most at risk and vulnerable. Do you just try to clean them up, or do you try to help them? You know.
Or do you throw them in jail?
Go ahead.
Sorry, a comment and a question. First comment was that I thought you guys would find it interesting to know that I used to work for the San Francisco VA, and so we're automatically all subject to random drug testing. And if you actually have a medical marijuana card, even though they're a government agency, they go by state law here in San Francisco. So if I were to get randomly drug tested and I had a card, then I wouldn't get fired. That was really interesting. I was super surprised by that when I worked there. And my question was, kind of in terms of access to mental health care. This kind of goes into what Daniel was saying, and even the Rat Park study is that, if you read Gabor Mate's books, or in general, addiction's highly tied into early childhood trauma and a lot of other mental illnesses. So my questions are, one to you, Irina, when you're doing your outreach, what kind of increased access to mental health is involved in your guys' outreach? And then also whether or not there's been much comparison studies in terms of how effective treating mental health needs and reducing addiction versus, like the drug war and reducing addiction, and what the cost of the comparison of the two would be to actually pour money into increased access to care versus, dumping it in the drug war.
I could go on about this. It's really, really frustrating to see how little money is put into mental health care, and also how stigmatized seeking mental health care is. I talk really openly about having a therapist and seeing her, and how I absolutely love it, but oftentimes people are like, ooh, whoa, that's a little weird, huh? Are you like crazy or something? We're required to get physicals before going to school, and never required to get some sort of mental health support. Unless they think you're crazy. Yeah. But, going along with that, drugs are very rarely the problem. Drugs are most often the side effect of a much bigger problem, and that problem is so evident in the city. I mean, it's really, really hard to even find support for addiction, but the serious problem is how impossible it is to get housing. That's the number one deal around here. It's funny because we're a homeless youth support organization, but the hardest thing that I have trouble with is figuring out how to help people get housing. There's nothing. The low income housing list, which we get every month, they list studios that are literally like $1,500 per person. I wouldn't be able to afford the low income housing list that I print out for my clients and say, oh, good luck. There's shelters, hardly any. There are shelters with 5-month-long wait lists around here. And so many people migrate over to the West Coast because of the climate and because of access to services. But if you're on the streets and don't have a house and can't get a job because of your criminal history, then, you're going to start using drugs if that's around, and you can sell drugs and then you can get a deal on your drugs. Like, that's the number one thing. And I think especially in incidents where people have really difficult mental health situations, and a lot of our clients do suffer from schizophrenia and do suffer from depression and anxiety and borderline personality disorder, and getting around without a support system really is really difficult when you don't have a network of people supporting you along the way, and all you hear is just negative comments from society. I think that helping people understand what a positive relationship looks like is really the number one thing that we do at the organization I work for, at the Crossroads. But there just needs to be more mental health support in general.
And I think also, just in terms of costs, like I said earlier, it costs $30 to $50K to keep someone behind bars. And drug treatment is cheaper than that.
Per day, right?
I think it's per year, $30,000-$50,000 a year to keep somebody behind bars.
If you're young and healthy.
Right. And drug treatment is oftentimes a cheaper option than that for people. Yet, we're much more readily willing to pay for them to be in jail than to pay for them to treat the underlying problem. I think also, something that we neglected to bring up that we had talked about in our planning was kind of about this vicious cycle that oftentimes, drug use can create in a community where, like you said, the drug use is almost not the biggest problem. In New York, where I'm from, I saw a tremendous number of people lose access to public housing as a result of drug convictions, because if you have a criminal record, you suddenly are no longer eligible for public housing. So maybe if you had a job and were living in public housing, you're suddenly homeless. Maybe your family lives in public housing, and now you can be arrested for setting foot on the premises, so you can't even visit your mom for Thanksgiving. Like, how is that going to affect you and your culture? Like, I mean, a family unit is such an important part, especially as somebody who might be struggling in life. So I think that's just an amazing atrocity. And how are you going to get a job with a record too? So it's such a cyclical, self-perpetuating spiral of problems that's created by the drug war there.
I think something that I see a lot of too is self-medication, especially in regards to mental health. I mean, there will be people who hear voices, but when they drink a lot, they don't hear them, or people who experience really intense pain that they can't get mental or physical help with, and they end up taking heroin because that's the only thing that'll make their pain go away. So I think our lack of support in those areas really does increase the self-medication. That's sometimes the only thing that's available to people.
And one final food for thought on this while we're on this topic. Something that came up for me recently, I met somebody, actually it was right outside a conference, I was outside, I was smoking. I meet somebody on the street, he needed a lighter. I didn't even notice, or know, I should say, that he was homeless, but he tells me he was homeless. And he tells me that he was recently diagnosed with HIV. And that actually, and I was like, oh my God, that's crazy. Feeling sympathetic for him. And he was like, actually, it's like one of the better things that's happened to me in the last couple of years, because suddenly, in San Francisco, he had access to all of these services he didn't have access to before. Because, the gay rights community here has done such a really good job of setting up services for people with HIV. It's not there for drug users. It is there for people with HIV. So I think that's, a really sad state of affairs, that someone's actually feeling like their life has been positively impacted by being diagnosed with HIV is just crazy.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've definitely actually had clients tell me after getting frustrated from not being able to access services, well, maybe I'll just go sleep with someone who's positive. Half joking, only half joking. And other people who will get themselves locked up in order to access services that inmates have access to after they get released. So it's a pretty bad state of affairs, and so much funding in San Francisco is being pulled from services every year. It's really sad.
Last question.
One comment is that with Obamacare, for the first time, insurance companies are required to provide mental health care coverage. It's not an option anymore to deny people. I was going to comment also about when we were talking about Israel and Portugal, and we're all humans, but Israel and Portugal didn't fight the war in Vietnam. The quote you guys had up there by Anslinger about the black people and the Mexicans and the artists being enemies. There's a culture war in this country, and it got very out of hand. I was 18 years old and had to sign up for the draft in Vietnam, and there was an intense hatred of the hippies, and there was an intense resentment of the black people for causing the civil rights movement that disrupted life as usual for those World War II vets that came home thinking they had saved the world, and that America was a very triumphalist place, it still is, that feels it has this exceptional role to play in the world, and that's part of what's going on here. People like Nixon use the drug war to oppress their enemies. They don't just use it to keep people from having drugs. They use it to be able to manipulate entire populations and keep them out of the governing process. And that gets under-discussed massively. It wasn't to take care of people, it was to fuck them up.
You can see that with marijuana majority too, how many big representatives have come out, even Obama saying, you know, I smoked and I inhaled because that was the point. You know? But he's not the one being targeted, other people are.
Thanks, Ken. Couldn't have put it better myself.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. We actually have to start packing up before the school closes down, so thank you all for coming. Thank you very much to the presenters for being here and the panel. We really appreciate all the knowledge you bring to us and the wisdom that you share, so thank you.